The most expensive mistake in the room wasn't the one on the contract. It was the man who believed the woman carrying the coffee couldn't possibly understand it. Ethan Blackwell had built a reputation on being right. Right about markets. Right about acquisitions. Right about people. By 39, the billionaire founder of Blackwell Capital had turned a small investment firm into one of the most powerful financial companies in America. People listened when he spoke. They agreed before he finished his sentences. And on a rainy Thursday afternoon in Manhattan, inside a private dining room overlooking Fifth Avenue, nobody expected that certainty to crack. The room glowed with soft amber light from designer fixtures hanging above a polished walnut table. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed a skyline wrapped in clouds. 8 executives sat around the table. Lawyers, analysts, investors. Every chair was occupied by someone whose decisions moved millions of dollars before lunch. At the head of the table sat Ethan Blackwell, checking the time on a Swiss watch that cost more than most people's monthly rent. The atmosphere felt electric. Months of negotiations had led to this moment. One signature, one agreement, one deal valued at nearly $1 billion. Across the room, unnoticed by almost everyone, Claire Whitmore quietly carried a silver tray through the door. Her black server uniform blended into the background. That was the strange thing about people like Claire. Most guests remembered the coffee. Almost nobody remembered who served it. She moved calmly between the executives, refilling cups and replacing glasses of sparkling water. Her posture was straight, her expression neutral, professional, invisible, exactly the way the job required. Ethan barely looked at her when she stopped beside him. He slid a folder across the table toward one of the attorneys and spoke without lifting his eyes. "Let's finish this. We've already wasted enough time." Several people laughed politely. Claire placed a fresh cup of coffee near his hand. Ethan glanced up for half a second, then back to the documents. To him, she was another server, another face in a uniform, another person passing through the edges of a world she could never understand. Or so he assumed. The meeting accelerated. Numbers filled the air. Valuations, equity percentages, international licensing rights, the language of billion-dollar decisions. Claire continued moving through the room. Quiet, efficient, unremarkable. Yet as she collected empty cups near the far end of the table, her eyes drifted briefly toward a page lying open beside one executive. Just a glance, barely a second, then another. Something made her slow down. Not enough for anyone to notice. Just enough for a feeling to settle in the back of her mind. A number. One percentage. One line buried among hundreds of pages. Claire lowered her eyes and continued walking. Maybe she had read it wrong. Maybe it was none of her business. Maybe she should simply finish her shift and go home. Outside, rain tapped softly against the glass. Inside, Ethan Blackwell reached for a pen. The room leaned forward. The final documents were ready. The billion-dollar deal was moments away from becoming official. And at that exact moment, while every expert at the table focused on the signature line, the only person staring at the wrong number was the waitress nobody bothered to notice. Claire Whitmore had learned long ago that being invisible had advantages. People revealed things when they believed nobody important was listening. They spoke freely, carelessly, honestly. As she carried her tray toward the service station, the conversation behind her continued without pause. Nobody lowered their voice. Nobody worried about the waitress overhearing. Why would they? To them, she was simply part of the furniture. Another uniform moving through the room. Claire placed several empty cups onto the counter and glanced once more toward the conference table through the open doorway. The documents remained spread across the polished wood. Lawyers exchanged comments. Executives reviewed notes. Ethan Blackwell sat confidently at the head of the table, one hand resting beside the contract that would soon change the future of 2 companies. Claire should have walked away. She knew that. Her shift was not about contracts. It was about coffee, desserts, and keeping customers happy. Yet something continued bothering her. That number. That percentage. She closed her eyes briefly. Sometimes the human brain noticed problems before logic could explain them. The feeling reminded her of college. Back when she spent entire nights inside the university library surrounded by financial reports and case studies. Back when professors filled whiteboards with acquisition models while she sat quietly in the front row taking notes faster than anyone else. A different life. A different version of Claire Whitmore. The memory disappeared as another server approached. Table 12 wants another bottle of sparkling water, the young woman said. Claire nodded and reached for a fresh bottle. I will take it. The server smiled. You always look so calm. If I had executives like that in my section, I would be terrified. Claire glanced toward the private dining room again. People are just people. The younger server laughed. Not billionaires. Claire said nothing. She simply picked up the bottle and returned toward the room. The rain outside had intensified. Water slid down the massive windows overlooking Manhattan. The city lights blurred into streaks of gold and white. Inside, the atmosphere felt increasingly focused. One attorney was now discussing final language revisions. Another executive checked projections displayed on a tablet. Ethan remained completely composed. He looked like a man who had already won. Claire approached quietly and began refilling glasses. As she moved behind one of the investors, her eyes caught the document again. This time the page remained open longer. Long enough. Her pulse slowed, then stopped. Not literally, but close. There it was, hidden inside a dense section of financial language. 1 decimal point. One tiny adjustment within a conversion formula. Easy to overlook. Almost impossible to notice unless someone understood exactly what they were looking at. Claire felt her stomach tighten. She read the line again, then a second time. The math did not work. The percentages contradicted another section several pages earlier. If executed as written, the ownership structure would shift dramatically after conversion. Millions would disappear, possibly much more. Claire lowered her gaze immediately. Surely someone else had seen it. There were lawyers here, analysts, advisors earning 6 and 7 figures a year. Entire careers existed to prevent mistakes like this. Yet nobody seemed concerned. Nobody looked alarmed. Ethan reached for his pen. The room leaned forward once more. Claire stared at the silver tray in her hands. Her shift, her job, her place. All of them told her to stay silent. But another voice spoke louder. The voice that remembered classrooms, financial models, endless nights studying numbers until sunrise. The voice that knew exactly what she had just seen. And as Ethan Blackwell prepared to sign the agreement, Claire realized she had only 2 choices. Walk away and forget it, or risk becoming the most unpopular person in the room. Claire stood motionless for 3 long seconds. Around her, nobody noticed the storm unfolding inside her mind. The executives remained focused on the agreement. Pens clicked. Tablets glowed. Coffee cooled inside expensive porcelain cups. Life continued exactly as expected. Except Claire now knew something that could change everything. She took a slow breath and stepped forward. Not toward the door. Toward the table. Her black shoes barely made a sound against the polished floor. One attorney was speaking about projected growth over the next 5 years when Claire stopped beside the table. Nobody looked up at first. Why would they? She was carrying a tray. Then she spoke. Excuse me. The room froze just enough to notice the interruption. Several faces turned toward her. Ethan Blackwell lifted his eyes from the contract. His expression suggested mild annoyance rather than curiosity. Claire immediately felt the weight of every gaze in the room. Investors, attorneys, executives, people whose combined net worth could purchase entire city blocks. Yet she kept her voice calm. I am sorry to interrupt, but I think there may be an issue in the conversion section of the agreement. Silence. Complete silence. One investor blinked. Another looked confused. Ethan stared at her for a moment as though he had not processed what she had said. Then a faint smile appeared. Not a friendly one. The kind adults give children who wander into conversations they do not understand. An issue, he asked. Claire nodded. Yes, sir. Ethan leaned back in his chair. Several people exchanged amused glances. One executive quietly chuckled. And how exactly would you know that? The question landed harder than the words themselves. Claire could feel the room already deciding the answer. She was a waitress. She carried coffee. Therefore, she could not possibly understand corporate finance. Simple. Convenient. Wrong. Claire looked toward the page. The conversion percentage on page 87 appears inconsistent with the ownership calculation referenced earlier. The amusement disappeared from a few faces. Not because they believed her, because she sounded specific. Ethan noticed it too. His eyes narrowed slightly. You reviewed the contract? Claire shook her head. Only what was visible while serving. A lawyer laughed openly. You identified $1 billion contractual issue from a glance. Several people smiled. Claire did not. She simply met Ethan's gaze. I could be mistaken. The room relaxed. There it was. The admission they expected. Then Claire continued. But if I am not, the post-conversion equity structure would change significantly. The smile vanished from Ethan's face. He studied her more carefully now. Not as a waitress. Not yet as an equal. But no longer as furniture. One of the senior attorneys reached for the contract. What section? Claire pointed politely. Paragraph 4, subsection C. The attorney flipped pages. The room watched. Ethan glanced at his Swiss watch. Impatience returned. We have spent 6 months negotiating this agreement, he said. I seriously doubt a server carrying coffee discovered something our legal teams missed. The words were not shouted. They did not need to be. They carried the quiet certainty of a man accustomed to being correct. Claire felt heat rise in her cheeks. Embarrassment. Doubt. The urge to apologize and leave. Yet she remained standing. Because the numbers still did not work. And deep down, she knew it. The senior attorney adjusted his glasses and lowered his eyes to the page Claire had indicated. At first his expression remained unchanged. Professional. Unconcerned. Certain. The room seemed to breathe again. Ethan tapped the table once with his pen. An investor reached for his coffee. Another checked messages on his phone. The interruption appeared to be ending. Then the attorney stopped turning pages. His fingers froze on the document. A small crease formed between his eyebrows. He read the paragraph again. Then he flipped backward several pages. Then forward once more. The room noticed. Conversations faded. Ethan leaned slightly forward. What is it? He asked. The attorney did not answer immediately. He continued reading. His confidence seemed to shrink with every passing second. Across the table, another lawyer sensed something unusual and leaned over. Let me see that. The document changed hands. Silence spread through the room like a slow-moving shadow. Claire remained standing beside the table, holding the empty silver tray. She wished she were anywhere else. Yet she could not look away. Ethan's expression hardened. He was not worried yet. Only irritated. Delays cost money. Delays disrupted momentum. Delays were unnecessary. Can someone explain what is happening? He asked. The second attorney looked up. For the first time all afternoon, uncertainty appeared on his face. There may be a discrepancy. Nobody spoke. Ethan stared at him. Maybe. The attorney swallowed. The conversion formula references a different ownership percentage than the one established in the earlier equity schedule. Ethan's pen stopped moving. The room became completely still. One investor sat up straighter. Another reached for the contract. Papers shifted softly across the polished table. The sound seemed unusually loud. Ethan extended his hand. Give me the document. The attorney passed it over. Ethan reviewed the pages himself. Numbers had always been his language. Markets. Risk. Valuation. He trusted numbers more than people. Yet the deeper he looked, the less comfortable he became. His eyes moved from one page to another. Back again. A decimal point. A percentage. A conversion mechanism buried beneath layers of legal terminology. Small details. Massive consequences. Claire watched his expression change almost imperceptibly. Confidence gave way to concentration. Concentration gave way to concern. The rain continued sliding down the windows behind him. Nobody touched their coffee. Nobody checked their phones. Ethan finally lowered the contract. Run the calculation again, he said quietly. One analyst opened a laptop. Another joined him. Fingers moved rapidly across keyboards. Spreadsheets appeared. Formulas were checked. Then checked again. The room waited. Seconds felt like minutes. Minutes felt longer. Claire could hear the faint hum of the city below, 80 floors beneath them. She considered slipping away while nobody was paying attention. But something kept her rooted in place. The lead analyst suddenly stopped typing. His face lost color. Ethan noticed immediately. Talk to me. The analyst looked up. If the agreement had been executed exactly as written, the ownership transfer would have triggered an unintended dilution event. Nobody moved. Nobody blinked. Ethan's jaw tightened. How much? The analyst glanced at the screen one final time. Then he answered. Approximately $1.2 billion. No one spoke for several seconds. The number seemed to hang in the air above the table like a storm cloud nobody could ignore. $1.2 billion. The analysts stared at their screens. The attorneys stared at the contract. The investors stared at Ethan Blackwell. And Ethan stared at Claire Whitmore. For the first time since she had entered the room, he was truly looking at her. Not at the uniform. Not at the tray. At her. Claire wished the floor would open beneath her. She had not stepped forward hoping to become the center of attention. She had only wanted to prevent a mistake. Yet now every eye in the room followed her. The silence became uncomfortable. Then one investor cleared his throat. How did she catch this? Nobody answered immediately. The question felt almost dangerous, because the answer forced everyone to confront the same reality. A room full of experts had missed what a waitress had noticed in seconds. Ethan slowly placed the contract on the table. His expression revealed nothing. Years of high-stakes negotiations had taught him how to hide emotion. But internally, he felt something unfamiliar. Embarrassment. Not because the mistake existed. Mistakes happened. Embarrassment because he remembered exactly what he had said to her minutes earlier. He remembered the amusement in his voice. The certainty. The assumption. Stick to serving coffee. The words echoed in his mind. Across the table, one of the senior attorneys adjusted his tie. Miss Whitmore, is it? Claire nodded quietly. Yes, sir. Have you worked in finance before? Several people leaned forward. Claire hesitated. The question seemed simple. The answer was not. No, she said carefully. Not professionally. The attorney frowned. Then how did you recognize the issue? Claire glanced toward the windows where rain continued sliding down the glass. She could feel her heartbeat in her chest. I studied financial analysis in college. The room grew quiet again. Another executive blinked. Studied? Claire nodded. For 3 years. Ethan watched her closely. Something about the answer did not fit the image he had created of her. In his mind, she had occupied a neat category. Simple, predictable, easy to understand. Yet that category was falling apart with every sentence she spoke. 3 years where? Another investor asked. Claire lowered her eyes briefly. Columbia University. The reaction was immediate. Several faces changed at once. Surprise, confusion, disbelief. One executive actually laughed softly, not out of mockery this time, but shock. Ethan said nothing. He simply continued studying her. Claire felt uncomfortable under the attention. She was not proud of the unfinished degree. She was not proud of leaving. Life had forced choices she never expected to make. Choices that could not be explained by a diploma hanging on a wall. One of the attorneys finally broke the silence. Well, he said slowly, glancing at the corrected calculations on the screen, it appears Columbia taught you very well. For the first time all afternoon, a faint smile touched Claire's face. Small, humble, gone almost instantly. But Ethan noticed it. And for reasons he could not yet explain, he found himself wondering who Claire Whitmore really was. The meeting officially paused, but nobody stood up. Nobody reached for the door. Nobody seemed interested in leaving. The billion-dollar problem had been solved, yet a different mystery had quietly taken its place. Claire Whitmore, the waitress from Columbia University, the woman who had spotted what experienced professionals had overlooked. Ethan Blackwell sat silently at the head of the table, his fingers resting on the unopened contract. The deal would move forward eventually. The attorneys would correct the language. The investors would receive updated documents. Business would continue. That was not what occupied his thoughts. His attention remained fixed on Claire. She was gathering empty cups now, returning to the same job she had been doing before everything changed. There was something almost surreal about it. 10 minutes earlier, nobody in the room knew her name. Now every person present was watching her. Yet Claire behaved as if nothing unusual had happened. No pride, no victory, no attempt to impress anyone. She simply collected dishes and prepared to leave. Ethan finally stood. The movement drew attention immediately. People were accustomed to following his lead. Conversation stopped. Claire turned slightly as he approached. For a brief moment, neither spoke. Ethan noticed details he had ignored before. The calm expression, the quiet confidence, the way she maintained eye contact without appearing intimidated. Most people acted differently around him. They became nervous, eager, careful. Claire did not. Miss Whitmore, he said. The words felt unfamiliar. He was not accustomed to addressing servers formally. Claire paused. Yes, Mr. Blackwell? Ethan glanced at the silver tray in her hands. Then back at her. You saved us from a very expensive mistake today. Claire offered a small, polite smile. I'm glad someone checked the numbers. Several executives exchanged looks. The answer surprised them. She was giving away credit. Most people would have done the opposite. Ethan noticed that too. Someone? He asked. You mean you? Claire shook her head gently. The attorneys verified it. The analysts recalculated it. I only pointed at a line. A faint smile appeared on the face of one investor. Another nodded quietly. The room's respect for her seemed to grow with every sentence. Ethan folded his arms. Most people would not have spoken up. Claire looked toward the rain-covered windows. Manhattan shimmered beyond the glass like a painting made of light. Most people would have assumed somebody else already noticed. Ethan considered that. He had built an empire around confidence, around trusting expertise, around believing the smartest people were sitting at the table. Yet the smartest observation today had come from the one person not invited to sit there. The realization was uncomfortable, necessary, humbling. Claire adjusted her grip on the tray. If there is nothing else, I should get back to work. Ethan almost laughed. Not because it was funny, because it was absurd. A room full of millionaires wanted answers from her, and she was worried about unfinished tables. Of course, he said. Claire nodded politely and turned away. Ethan watched her walk toward the door. For reasons he could not explain, he suddenly felt that allowing her to disappear would be a mistake. Not a billion-dollar mistake. Something different. Something personal. And as the door quietly closed behind her, Ethan Blackwell realized there was one question he could not stop asking himself. If Claire Whitmore was capable of this, what else had the world failed to notice about her? The meeting finally ended nearly an hour later. Revised documents were prepared. Fresh calculations were verified 3 separate times. The deal survived. The investors shook hands. Attorneys gathered folders. One by one, the powerful people who had entered the room with complete confidence left carrying a new sense of caution. Yet Ethan Blackwell remained seated long after everyone else was gone. The private dining room had become quiet. Only the distant sound of rain against glass remained. A half-finished cup of coffee sat beside him. Cold now. Forgotten. Ethan looked toward the empty doorway where Claire had disappeared. Something about the afternoon refused to leave his mind. It was not merely the mistake. It was the way she had handled it. No celebration. No self-promotion. No attempt to leverage the moment for personal gain. In Ethan's world, opportunities were currency. Most people grabbed them immediately. Claire had walked away from one without hesitation. That alone made her different. Downstairs, the restaurant had returned to its normal rhythm. Plates clinked softly. Conversations blended together. The city moved on. Claire moved through her section carrying orders and clearing tables as though the afternoon had been entirely ordinary. Yet several employees kept glancing at her. Word had traveled faster than she expected. One manager approached her near the service station. I heard what happened upstairs. Claire sighed quietly. People talk fast. Apparently faster than billion-dollar lawyers. The manager smiled. Claire laughed despite herself. Please do not start. Too late. Half the staff already knows. Claire shook her head and returned to work. Attention made her uncomfortable. She preferred routines. Predictable things. Coffee orders. Receipts. Conversations that ended when customers walked out the door. The last thing she wanted was to become a story. But fate seemed to have different plans. Near 7 o'clock, a black luxury sedan stopped outside the restaurant entrance. Nobody paid much attention at first. Manhattan was full of expensive cars. Then the front door opened. Ethan Blackwell stepped inside. The dining room changed instantly. Not dramatically. Subtly. Heads turned. Conversations paused. A hostess nearly dropped a menu. Ethan ignored all of it. His eyes scanned the room until they found Claire. She was carrying a tray of dessert plates toward a corner booth. For a brief moment, she looked genuinely surprised. Ethan crossed the restaurant without an entourage, without assistants, without attorneys. Just a man in a dark suit carrying questions he could not seem to answer alone. Claire set down the tray and turned toward him. Mr. Blackwell. Ethan stopped a few feet away. For the first time in years, he felt uncertain about what to say. Negotiations were easy. Boardrooms were easy. This was not. I hope I am not interrupting. Claire glanced around the nearly full dining room. A faint smile appeared. You are standing in the middle of my shift. Ethan almost smiled back. Almost. Then his expression became serious. I would like to understand something. Claire waited. Ethan looked directly at her. If you were capable of seeing what nobody else saw today, why are you working here? The question hung between them. Simple. Honest. And for the first time all afternoon, Claire Whitmore looked away. Claire kept her eyes on the floor for a moment. Around them, the restaurant continued moving. Orders were called. Glasses clinked softly. A family laughed near the windows. Life carried on, unaware that a billionaire was standing beside a waitress waiting for an answer that suddenly seemed very important. Ethan noticed the hesitation. It was different from nervousness. Claire was choosing her words carefully. Finally, she looked back at him. Because life does not always follow the plan you make when you are 20. Ethan said nothing. The answer felt incomplete, but somehow honest. Claire glanced toward one of her tables where customers were finishing dessert. I should check on them. 1 minute, Ethan said. Not as an order, almost as a request. Claire studied him. The change was subtle, but she could see it. The certainty he carried upstairs was gone. Curiosity had replaced it. My mother became sick during my 3rd year, Claire said quietly. The treatments were expensive. Insurance helped, but not enough. Ethan listened. I left school to work. Temporarily? Claire smiled faintly. That was the idea. Outside, headlights reflected across the rain-soaked streets of Manhattan. Inside, Ethan felt an unfamiliar discomfort. Not pity. Respect. He knew what sacrifice looked like in financial reports. Numbers on spreadsheets. Cost projections. Resource allocation. This was different. This was what sacrifice looked like when it had a face. Did you ever go back? He asked. Claire shook her head. By the time things stabilized, there were bills. Rent. Responsibilities. The world keeps moving whether you are ready or not. Ethan looked around the restaurant. Suddenly, the place appeared different to him. He had eaten in restaurants his entire life. Thousands of meals. Thousands of servers. How many stories had he ignored because he assumed he already understood people? The realization was unsettling. Claire checked her watch. My table is waiting. Ethan nodded. Of course. But before she could leave, another voice interrupted. Excuse me. Both turned. It was one of the investors from the meeting upstairs. An older man named Walter Hughes. He had apparently remained in the restaurant after everyone else left. Walter approached carrying a folded copy of the corrected agreement. Miss Whitmore, he said, I wanted to thank you personally. Claire looked surprised. Walter extended his hand. I have spent 30 years reviewing transactions. Today you caught something I missed. Several nearby diners glanced over curiously. Claire shook his hand politely. Anyone could have noticed it. Walter laughed softly. No, they could not have. That is why nobody did. Ethan watched the exchange carefully. Walter Hughes was not a man known for compliments. Yet his admiration appeared genuine. The older investor reached into his jacket and removed a business card. If you ever decide you are tired of carrying trays, call me. Claire accepted the card but did not look at it. Thank you. Walter smiled and walked away. Ethan noticed something interesting. Most people would have reacted with excitement. Claire simply slipped the card into her apron pocket and returned her attention to her customers. As though the offer meant nothing. As though opportunities worth millions were not rare. As though character mattered more than status. And for the second time that day, Ethan Blackwell found himself completely unable to predict what Claire Whitmore would do next. The dinner rush finally began to slow around 9 o'clock. Rain still traced silver lines across the restaurant windows, but the crowds had thinned and the constant rhythm of orders had softened into something calmer. Claire moved through her remaining tables with the same steady professionalism she had shown all evening. If anyone had walked into the restaurant at that moment, they would never have guessed she had altered the outcome of a billion-dollar transaction only a few hours earlier. Ethan noticed that. He remained seated at a corner table he had not ordered from, watching the room more than the menu. He had spent most of his adult life surrounded by people chasing something. Promotions, influence, access, wealth. Yet Claire seemed entirely uninterested in all of it. That fact bothered him more than he cared to admit. Most people revealed themselves when opportunity appeared. Claire revealed almost nothing. Near the service station, she removed Walter Hughes's business card from her apron pocket and looked at it briefly. The card represented possibilities many people would consider life-changing. A direct connection to one of the most respected investors in the country. An open door into a world she had supposedly left behind. Claire studied the card for a few seconds. Then she slipped it back into her pocket and continued stacking menus. No excitement. No celebration. No visible reaction. Ethan shook his head slightly. He could not understand her, which only made him more curious. As the final guests prepared to leave, Claire stepped outside the employee entrance for a moment of fresh air. The city smelled of rain and concrete. Headlights reflected across wet pavement. Manhattan felt quieter than usual. She stood beneath the awning, enjoying 30 seconds of silence. Then she heard the door open behind her. Ethan stepped outside. Neither spoke immediately. The sound of distant traffic filled the space between them. Finally, Ethan looked toward the street and said, "You know, if someone had told me this morning that a waitress would save one of the biggest deals of my career, I would have laughed." Claire smiled faintly. "That seems reasonable." Ethan glanced at her. "Does it?" Claire nodded. "People see uniforms before they see people." The answer landed harder than she intended. Ethan looked away. Because the truth was uncomfortable. He remembered exactly what he had assumed when he first saw her. Exactly how quickly he had dismissed her. Exactly how wrong he had been. For a moment, neither said anything. Then Ethan asked the question that had been forming in his mind all evening. "If your mother had never become sick, where do you think you would be now?" Claire watched rainwater slide from the edge of the awning. "Honestly." Ethan nodded. "Honestly." Claire smiled. Not a sad smile. Not a bitter one. Just honest. Probably somewhere else making different mistakes. Ethan laughed unexpectedly. A genuine laugh. The first one all day. Claire looked surprised. Ethan shook his head. "You are not what I expected." Claire looked at him calmly. "That makes two of us, Mr. Blackwell." And standing there beneath the glow of a streetlight reflected on rain-soaked pavement, Ethan realized something important. The most valuable thing Claire Whitmore had given him that day was not the $1 billion she had helped protect. It was a lesson far more difficult to learn. The danger of believing you understand someone's worth before you know their story. The following morning, Ethan arrived at Blackwell Capital earlier than usual. The city was still waking up. Sunlight reflected off glass towers. Traffic moved steadily below. Inside the executive offices, assistants prepared schedules and analysts reviewed reports. Everything looked normal. Yet Ethan's attention was fixed on a single name. Claire Whitmore. He entered his office, set his briefcase beside the desk, and stared through the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Manhattan. Then he pressed a button on his phone. "Megan, can you come in for a moment?" His chief of staff appeared less than a minute later carrying a tablet. "Good morning." Ethan nodded. "I need information on someone." Megan raised an eyebrow. "Requests like that usually involve competitors, acquisitions, or major clients." "Who?" Ethan hesitated briefly. "Claire Whitmore." Megan searched the name. "Employee?" "No." The answer seemed to confuse her even more. "Potential hire?" Ethan looked toward the skyline. "Possibly." By noon, a preliminary report sat on his desk. Ethan opened it expecting a simple story. He was wrong. The first pages confirmed what Claire had shared. Columbia University. Top academic performance. Multiple scholarships. Exceptional evaluations from professors. Then came details she had never mentioned. Research projects. National finance competitions. Recommendations from respected economists. One note caught Ethan's attention immediately. Claire had placed first in a national investment modeling challenge during her second year. More than 400 students had participated. She had won. Ethan leaned back slowly. The deeper he read, the more surprising the story became. There were no signs of failure. No indication she lacked talent. No evidence she had ever been unable to compete with the best. In fact, every document suggested the opposite. Then he reached the section describing her departure from school. The report became thinner after that. Fewer achievements. More employment records. Restaurant jobs. Temporary positions. Long hours. Practical decisions. Life had not defeated Claire. Life had simply redirected her. Ethan closed the folder and stared at the cover. A strange feeling settled over him. Regret. Not for her choices. For his assumptions. How many people had he dismissed because their current circumstances hid their real capabilities? How many stories had he never bothered to learn? A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. Megan stepped inside again. "The board meeting starts in 10 minutes. Ethan nodded absent-mindedly. Then he asked a question that surprised even himself. "Do you know what the hardest thing is about success?" Megan looked confused. "No." Ethan glanced at the report. "It convinces you that you can accurately measure people in 30 seconds. Megan followed his gaze toward the folder, but said nothing. After she left, Ethan opened his desk drawer and looked at the corrected contract from the previous day. $1.2 billion. That was the number everyone remembered. The number that made headlines if discovered. The number investors cared about. Yet sitting alone in his office, Ethan realized something far more valuable had happened. A woman carrying a coffee tray had exposed a flaw in his judgment. And unlike a financial mistake, that flaw had existed for years. 3 days passed. The corrected agreement was finalized. Investors signed. Markets responded positively. Financial news celebrated the transaction as another victory for Blackwell Capital. Yet Ethan found himself thinking less about the deal and more about the person who had prevented it from becoming a disaster. Late Thursday afternoon, he returned to the restaurant. Not because he needed a meal. Not because he had a meeting nearby. He came because there was something unfinished between them. The restaurant was quieter than usual. Soft jazz drifted through the dining room. Sunlight filtered through tall windows, painting warm reflections across polished tables. Claire was reviewing receipts behind the service station when she noticed him. This time she did not look surprised, almost as though she had expected him eventually. Ethan approached with a small envelope in his hand. "Good afternoon, Claire." She offered a polite smile. "Mr. Blackwell." Ethan set the envelope on the counter. Claire glanced at it, but did not touch it. "What is that?" Ethan exhaled slowly. He had negotiated billion-dollar agreements with less hesitation. "A thank you." Claire looked at the envelope again, then back at him. "I already told you. I only pointed out a line in a contract." Ethan shook his head. "No. You did something most people would not have done." Claire crossed her arms lightly. "And what is that?" Ethan met her eyes. "You spoke up when it would have been easier to stay silent." The answer seemed to catch her off guard. For a moment neither spoke. Around them, customers continued eating lunch. Glasses clinked softly. A waiter carried a tray toward the kitchen. Ordinary life continued around an extraordinary conversation. Claire finally pushed the envelope back toward him. "I cannot accept money." Ethan almost smiled. "You did not even open it." "I do not need to." Ethan looked down at the envelope, then back at her. "You know, most people would have accepted it before I finished the sentence." Claire's expression softened slightly. "That is probably why you expected me to." Ethan laughed quietly. Not because she was wrong, because she was right. Again, he slipped the envelope back into his jacket. "Then let me ask you something else." Claire waited. Ethan leaned against the counter. "What do you want?" The question seemed simple, yet Claire took longer to answer than he expected. She looked across the dining room toward a young server, helping an elderly customer read a menu. Then she looked out the window at the city beyond. "I want to finish what I started." Ethan understood immediately. "School." Claire nodded. "Eventually." Ethan studied her for a moment. Then a thought occurred to him. Not a business calculation. Not a strategy. Something far more human. "Claire," he said quietly, "you saved my company from losing more than $1 billion." She shook her head gently. "No. Your company saved itself. It just needed someone willing to ask a question." Ethan fell silent. Because once again, she refused to place herself above anyone else. And standing there in the middle of a restaurant, surrounded by ordinary people living ordinary lives, Ethan realized that Claire Whitmore possessed something rarer than intelligence. She possessed humility strong enough to survive success. 2 weeks later, Ethan stood inside a lecture hall at Columbia University. Rows of seats stretched upward beneath bright lights. Students crossed the aisles carrying laptops and notebooks, talking about exams, internships, and future careers. It was a world Claire had once known well. A world she had left behind before she was ready. Ethan looked around quietly. For years he had funded scholarships through foundations and corporate programs. He had attended ceremonies, signed checks, delivered speeches. Yet this was the first time he truly understood what education could represent to someone who had sacrificed it. In his hand was a folder. Simple, unremarkable, important. Later that evening, he returned to the restaurant. The dinner crowd had not yet arrived. Claire was organizing receipts near the front counter when she saw him enter. This time she smiled before he reached her. "You are becoming a regular customer." Ethan returned the smile. "I'm not sure the restaurant would agree. I rarely order anything." Claire laughed softly. The sound surprised him. It was rare, genuine, the kind of laugh that appeared only when someone forgot to be guarded. Ethan placed the folder on the counter. Claire looked down at it, then back at him. "What is this?" "Open it." Claire hesitated. Then she did. Her eyes moved across the first page. Then the second. Her expression changed immediately. Confusion, disbelief, silence. The documents outlined a complete academic reinstatement package. Tuition assistance, financial support, flexible scheduling. Everything necessary to finish the degree she had abandoned years earlier. Claire looked up. "What is this?" Ethan answered carefully. "An opportunity." Claire closed the folder. I cannot accept charity. Ethan had expected that response. Good, he said. Because it is not charity. Claire stared at him. Ethan continued. You earned this before we ever met. The difference is that nobody bothered to notice. The words settled between them. Neither moved. Neither spoke. Finally, Claire lowered her eyes to the folder again. For the first time since Ethan had known her, emotion became visible. Not dramatic. Not overwhelming. Just a quiet crack in the composure she carried every day. Why? She asked softly. Ethan thought about the question. The answer surprised even him. Because someone once taught me that talent can hide in places people stop looking. Claire remained silent. Ethan glanced around the restaurant. The familiar tables. The coffee cups. The polished floors. The ordinary setting where everything had changed. Then he looked back at her. And because I owe you an apology. Claire frowned slightly. Ethan met her eyes. The first time I saw you, I thought I knew exactly who you were. He paused. I was wrong. The restaurant seemed unusually quiet. Claire studied him for a long moment. Then she smiled. Small. Warm. Forgiving. Most people would not admit that. Ethan nodded slowly. That is probably why most people keep making the same mistake. For the first time since the day of the meeting, neither felt the need to say anything more. Some truths did not require long speeches. They simply required honesty. And standing there with a folder between them and a future reopening in front of her, Claire realized something important. The greatest change was not that her circumstances were improving. The greatest change was that someone had finally learned to see her clearly. 6 months later, the first snow of winter drifted quietly across the Columbia University campus. Students hurried between buildings carrying backpacks and coffee cups, their breath visible in the cold morning air. Inside a lecture hall overlooking the city, Claire Whitmore sat near the front row taking notes as a professor discussed market behavior and investment strategy. Some things had changed. Some had not. She was back where she once thought she would never return. Yet the same calm focus remained in her eyes. The same quiet determination. The same refusal to seek attention. Around her, classmates debated theories and career plans. Most of them had no idea that the woman sitting beside them had once prevented a billion-dollar mistake while carrying a coffee tray through a Manhattan restaurant. Claire preferred it that way. Across town, Ethan Blackwell stood in his office reviewing quarterly reports. The company was thriving. The corrected deal had become one of the most successful transactions in Blackwell Capital's history. But on a shelf behind his desk sat a simple framed restaurant receipt. Visitors often noticed it and asked why it was there. Ethan always smiled, then changed the subject. Because the receipt reminded him of something more valuable than profit. It reminded him of perspective. It reminded him that wisdom does not always arrive wearing a tailored suit. Sometimes it arrives carrying coffee. Later that afternoon, Claire received a message on her phone. Good luck on your final presentation tomorrow. Ethan. She smiled and typed back a short reply. Thank you. Then she returned to studying. No dramatic speeches. No grand celebrations. Just mutual respect. The kind built slowly through honesty. The kind that lasts. Months earlier, Ethan had believed success meant knowing how to evaluate people quickly. Claire had taught him something different. The most important qualities often hide beneath circumstances, beneath uniforms, beneath titles, beneath assumptions. And Claire had learned something too. Sometimes life delays a dream. It does not destroy it. Sometimes the path changes. The destination does not. As evening settled over New York City, lights appeared one by one across the skyline. In classrooms, in offices, in apartments high above the streets. Millions of stories unfolding at once. Some loud, some quiet, some waiting to be noticed. Claire closed her notebook and looked out the window. Snow continued falling beyond the glass. A peaceful smile touched her face. Not because everything had become perfect, but because she no longer needed the world to recognize her value. She already knew it. And perhaps that was the real victory. Not proving someone wrong. Not changing a billionaire's opinion. But remembering your own worth when nobody else can see it yet. Because the most extraordinary people are often the ones the world calls ordinary. If this story stayed with you, take a moment to share what part touched your heart the most. And if you enjoy stories about quiet strength, dignity, and unexpected wisdom, we would be honored to have you join us again for the next one.